All right. Oh, I think we will. Just this for smaller people. Is that going to be good? Yeah, that'll be good. Okay. Welcome, everybody. The American Folklore Society and the Women's Section are very happy to welcome you to Her Story, a Feminism and Folklore Perspective Retrospective 2017, otherwise known as Part 2. So last year, as many of you remember, we at Kay's inspiration, we gathered many of the people who have been involved in feminist work in the society from the early days, which were mostly early days started in the 70s, to talk more or less chronologically about the developments and their contribution to them over about the first 25 years, up until the mid-90s. And we actually last year had a group of some of these younger scholars and a few others lined up, but of course Kay and I over-imagined how much we could fit in. So they didn't get much of a chance to talk. So we wanted to invite them again to have a full session to really talk about the time since in the last 20 years or so. So we're delighted to have these scholars with us. Each will introduce herself, and they decided in consultation, rather than trying to divide up by time periods, that they're each going to take a theme and talk about it over most of that time period. So I will let them proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Hi. I'm Christina Downs. I just finished my PhD at Indiana University. And I'm going to be talking about pedagogy and feminism. And we also collectively decided as we were working this out that we wanted to kind of, it does work. Hooray. All right. So, theme of witches. And I think you can find some obvious tie-ins to witches and pedagogy. But the actual, I wanted to start with the personal narrative, appropriate for folklore as well. And that a lot of people who know me know this story because I like to tell it a lot, which is that I was actually accused of witchcraft in high school. More particularly with putting a curse on a member of the school basketball team. Fortunately, it wasn't Indiana, so it's just the basketball team, and nobody cares about the basketball teams that much in the South except members of the basketball team. Who confronted me one day on a back staircase, and it was probably the only moment in my life where I had that brilliant line at the moment that you need the brilliant line, which was when they asked me if I had put a curse on him. I just looked at them and I said, no, to do that I would have needed blood. Lots of blood, and I just kind of kept walking. And kind of one of those little tiny moments in your past that you're really proud of, and I didn't quite understand, I think, everything that was going on in that story until years later when I was working on my master's degree at George Mason, and I told the story in a storytelling club meeting, and Peggy Yoakum, in that way that Peggy does, for those of you that Peggy kind of looked at me very seriously and said, that's a really great story, Christina, because stories of witches are always stories of women's knowledge and women's power, and it's just a really great story, all the things that are going on. And so for helping me to understand that story and why that was such an important story to me, and for everything, I just kind of want to give a shout out and a thank you to all of the wonderful witches and brujas who have helped me along my way in folklore, whether those are advisors or the people here at AFS. So that's my pedagogy and witch time. A little tangential, but. So, last year I gave a paper at AFS on the inclusion of scholarship by women on folklore syllabi. And I'm not going to go through all of it because I don't have time, but in summary what I found is that only about 30% of the works included on folklore syllabi, and this was across programs, across different sorts of courses, and also looking at introductory to folklore classes, only about 30% of the scholarship being taught in folklore classes is scholarship by women. And there's also a startling number of folklore syllabi that have no works of scholarship by women. And on the one level, 30% doesn't sound like such a terrible number if you're reaching for 50% until you think about the fact that it's just past halfway to 50%. There is also the fact that if you look around at this meeting, you'll see that far more than half of folklorists are women, so I think to say that we're aiming for 50% is a bad number to aim for. I have since learned that 30% is about the percentage at which people perceive equality when people are talking. So at a meeting, for example, if only 30% of the speech that happens comes from women, people will perceive that as men and women speaking equally. So these are some things that I think are important to think about. The responses I've gotten to that have been mostly positive. I've gotten a lot of encouraging responses, but I've also gotten a lot of excuses that I'm losing patience with. One of the big excuses I get all the time is, well, you have to understand that until recently there weren't many women in folklore. Which is completely inaccurate. That's overlooking the legacy of women like Ruth Benedict, Elsie Clues Parsons. And the response I always get to that is, yeah, but they weren't really folklorists. Their degrees were in anthropology or some other field, and I would like to remind everybody that Richard Dorson didn't have a degree in folklore either. No one's using that to say he wasn't a real folklorist. Even if we were to pretend like there weren't women involved in the very early days of folkloristics, this panel and the one last year were to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Baltimore Conference, which had a very strong focus on feminist folklore scholarship. That was 30 years ago. In 30 years, I think it's possible that some of those wonderful women scholars created some works of scholarship and maybe wrote something, but, what do I know? The scholarship I haven't done yet on folklore syllabi, and the scholarship that needs to be done, is to look at the inclusion of works of scholarship by scholars of color. And I think if we're to make an argument about feminism, we need to recognize that there is a legacy of white feminism that hasn't been as inclusive, that at its best has been not as inclusive as it should be, at its worst has been aggressively racist. And we need to recognize that, and we need to fight against that. And I say someone needs to look at the level of scholarship by scholars of color that's being included in folklore syllabi. I don't actually think anyone does, because I think we already know how bad that is. And I think all of us, if we look at syllabi, would think about syllabi that we've had, syllabi that we've taught. There are some people that are doing great jobs with this. I don't want to make a blanket statement. And probably the people that are doing a great job of this are some of the people that are in this room. But we need to talk to our colleagues, to our professors, and make sure that this doesn't happen. All of those arguments about scholars of color, that people make about women folklorists, are the same ones they make about scholars of color. Well, there haven't been many scholars of color in the field for a long time. We've had people like Zora Neale Hurston, America Paredes, that were writing a very long time ago and writing really seminal works in this field, and absolutely deserve to be included in folklore syllabi. We also need to think about how canons got created. We need to think about who was creating what got dubbed the folklore canon, and what agendas they were trying to accomplish by creating those canons. Again, sometimes I think it was complete carelessness that certain works got dropped, certain works didn't get the attention that they deserved, and sometimes it was something a little more dark, something a little more deliberate to exclude certain works. I'm not sure if I really need to say why representation on syllabi is important, but just for the sake of putting it out there, I think it's really important that we include in our syllabi perspectives from women and from scholars of color for a couple of reasons. One thing is we've had a lot of dialogue in this field and at this meeting in recent years about the lack of diversity in the field of folkloristics. And I think this is a really big reason why we have this lack of diversity. When students walk into a folklore classroom and they don't see anything that's written by a scholar they can relate to, a scholar that looks like them, that sends a message that this is not a place for them, and that's not an okay message to be sending our students. But it's not just for female students and for male students and for students of color that we need to be including these voices. Mm-hmm. We also need to make sure that our cisgendered, heterosexual, white male students know that their perspectives are not the only ones. It's very easy, I think, when you're only reading works of scholarship that are written by people like you, to imagine that everyone thinks the way that you do, and that doesn't create good folklore scholars. I think the field of folkloristics is one that, by the very nature of what we study, should be inclusive and should be progressive and should be decolonizing, and it hasn't been up to this point to the degree that it should be. I mean, there have been scholars who have been doing wonderful work on this. I don't want to exclude their legacy, but I think that there's so much more that needs to be done. I'm not advocating throwing out the canon completely. I do think that we need to know where we've been, if for no other reason than to recognize some of the mistakes that we've made in the past. But we can balance the canon with newer works of scholarship and for scholarships and with works of scholarship that have been ignored, and create that. My last point is that feminist pedagogy is and must be more than just teaching works of scholarship written by women or even women and scholars of color. It must also be our methodologies that we're using in the classroom. really think about how are we creating a balance of voices in the classroom. Remember that straight white men basically are encouraged and given the sanction from day one that their voices are important, and not everybody gets that same sanction. So, and I acknowledge it's difficult sometimes to create a balance of voices in your classroom without othering students. I think a lot of us have witnessed situations where a professor has turned to the one black student in the class and gone, tell us the black perspective on this. And that's not an okay pedagogical strategy either. And then the last thing in terms of feminist pedagogy and things that we can do to create a better environment in the folklore classroom is I've talked to several female scholars in my age range and younger who have had experiences in classrooms where male colleagues have made statements that were not okay, statements about their clothing, about their bodies. And what I think is most upsetting to me about that is none of them had a story about how the professor immediately responded to that and shut that down. Ideally, we would be creating an environment in which everyone knows that that's not an okay thing to say in our classrooms, but we also need to make sure that when those things happen in our classroom, we make sure that that's shut down, that the person who has been victimized there knows that that's not an okay thing to have had happen to them, and that the person that did it knows that they're not allowed to do that again.
I'm Lisa Gilman, based at the University of Oregon, and my task today is to talk about feminism and folklore fieldwork since 1995. I have to say that the idea of threading the witch theme throughout was a little difficult for me because I do research in Malawi where witchcraft is alive and real, and right at the moment there's a huge witch hunt going on and people are being killed because of that are suspected of being vampires through mob violence. So I don't have kind of a touchy-feely positive feeling about witches right now, but I appreciate the theme. But since I'm talking about fieldwork, and that's where I do fieldwork, it seems appropriate to bring that up. So in thinking about fieldwork, feminism has obviously impacted ethnographic fieldwork methods and methodologies across the social sciences and humanities, though feminists are often not given as much credit for the big paradigmatic shift that happened with the so-called postmodern turn in research methods. As with so much, the women were at the forefront of many changes. This speaks to what Christina was talking about. Men have tended to get the credit and to be the ones cited as the initiators of, and founders. I have too much of them. As the initiators and founders of new ideas and methods. Folklorists, regardless of whether or not they are feminists, have been greatly impacted by these shifts in methods, and feminist folklorists have been actively involved in reshaping the field through what they do fieldwork about and also how they do fieldwork. Though innovating in the field, which is producing important feminist work, folklore feminists have been less active about writing specifically about research methods and methodologies. That is, feminist folklorist ethnographic writing might include a discussion or evidence of methods, but few feminist folklorists have written essays or monographs specifically about feminist fieldwork, with some exceptions, most notably Elaine Wallace's publications on reciprocal ethnography and her innovative project with Heather Carver, Troubling Violence. Katie Borland's essay, That's Not What I Said, Interpretive Conflict and Oral Narrative Research, was published in Women's Words. It's a feminist analysis about fieldwork, interpersonal relationships, and the politics of interpretation. Most of the fieldwork methods and writing about methods in folklore, specifically by folklorists, has been by men. I one by women actually is Natalie Underberg's essay, Virtual and Reciprocal Ethnography on the Internet. So she uses Wallace's framework to think about interactive collaborative projects. So the fieldwork methods textbooks have been written by men. There is fieldworking, reading and writing research by Bonnie Bonnie Stone Sustein and Elizabeth Cesare Stater. It's not explicitly a folklore textbook, but it is about women, and I'm sure it's shaped by feminism. So if women aren't publishing about what we do in the field, and again, I know that many of us write about our methods and methodologies in our studies, but I'm talking about works that are explicitly about methods from a feminist perspective. How do I see the relationship between feminism and folklore and fieldwork practice? And I should say that I do think, well, I should plug, first of all, that John Fenn and I have a fieldwork textbook that's in publication right now. So there will be a fieldwork textbook very soon that is indeed informed by feminist approaches. I'm sure there are some things that I've missed, so my apologies for those that I've missed. And I think it would be interesting, and I didn't have time to do this, to go through the ethnographic studies where feminists have written about what they've done in the field and bring that out to the fore. And really, I think we'd get a much more nuanced and complex discussion about feminist fieldwork methods than I'm putting together for today. So one thing I think that feminism has brought to fieldwork is some changes to thinking about topics. So recognizing the first step in a fieldwork project is coming up with what you're going to do fieldwork about. So the selection of topic has been important to fieldwork. I think there's been an increase in different kinds of topics that previously wasn't considered folklore, so gossip, rumors, different kind of domestic labor, recognizing the aesthetics and what's going on with those. Attention to multiple identities and intersectional positioning as integrally tied to what topics we choose or anybody chooses. There's been a lot of studying of groups that were previously neglected, fieldwork with women family members, fieldwork with disenfranchised and marginalized and oppressed individuals as a particular, as kind of a politically motivated fieldwork. Attention to bodies, understanding that it is bodies that go out and do fieldwork and recognizing the implications of that. Attention to sensations beyond sight. There's been a lot of writing about seeing as being kind of in a very masculinist paradigm, but recognizing that feeling and smelling and taste and all of that are just as important to the fieldwork, to what we're doing in the field. Attention to desire, pleasure in the fieldwork process and in the presentation of findings. More topics about sexuality, both mainstream sexuality and alternate, and a lot of work on gender identities. And for me, what's really important, I think, a move away from the romanticization of folklore as a study of nice stuff by nice people. That's still very much there. But there's been more field work on topics of displacement, violence, various forms of oppression, war, racism, domestic abuse, disease, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all this kind of stuff. So associated with topics is also, I think, a real recognition and attention to the issue of power, and recognizing that power is absolutely manifest and implicated in everything we do in the field. And that's really closely associated with the idea of thinking about intersectional identities and positionality, and not just of the field worker. I think a lot of times we talk a lot about the intersectional, who the field workers are, what's their positionality, but recognizing that each individual we're doing field work with also has a positionality, and that impacts what that relationship is, and knowing that our positionalities and our identities are constantly shifting, which makes for real complications in terms of even understanding what's going on in those relationships. So reflexivity about the power going in a lot of different directions in fieldwork. Recognition, acknowledgement, and integration of subjectivity and reflexivity into topic choice, research design, interpretation, and production. Those things need to be front and center at all the phases. I think there's been some effort, probably not enough, to address power differentials, things like developing collaborative methods, idea that field workers studying their own communities, especially when these are groups that are marginalized and often othered in social research. So we have making sure that we're having people from all sorts of communities doing fieldwork on their own. And I would say we don't emphasize enough having field workers doing, I'll give an example. We talk a lot about the colonizing. I do research in Africa, so that obviously the research I do is grounded in a colonial history. And we talk a lot about the problems of having, Americans and Europeans going and doing fieldwork in African context. But what we don't have a lot of is Africans coming to the US and writing about our folklore. I think that would really, to me, be revolutionizing in terms of thinking about the power differentials. I think we're reflecting a lot about these power differentials, but maybe not really breaking apart the paradigm as much as it needs to. The idea that fieldwork projects should emerge from communities rather than people saying, I want to do this project, hey, can I do this fieldwork with you? But rather, whether as a member of a community or not, having the process come up from the ground, that the fieldwork is stuff that the community is involved with in terms of it being important and relevant to them, and then involved in all the different steps. And of course, Lawless and her Lawless's reciprocal ethnography idea is really intended to address the politics of power, especially in the production of final products and the interpretive and what happens in the interpretive process. So I think the big question of who benefits when we do field work is a huge one, and one that we've been paying more attention to, and this certainly draws from that idea of that comes out of feminism. So since I only have a few minutes, I wanted to just briefly talk about what I think is missing. And I would say that in folklore, we still have a romantic generalization of women's experience without regard to intersectionality. And we really, that's something that I think is absolutely key, that we really need to really think about how we're forefronting dominant cultures and how they're associated with colonialism, with whiteness, with economic differentials and so forth. Not enough publications on methods by folklorists of color addressing methods and methodological issues from the perspective of belonging to a marginalized group, doing fieldwork in marginalized communities, and also thinking about people. I think we talk more about, like, what does it mean if you are a white field worker going into a community of color in the United States, or going into, as my research, into in the context that was previously colonized. But we don't talk about it so much the other way. I remember one of my first years teaching fieldwork, I had an African-American student, and we were in Eugene, Oregon, which is very white, and she wanted to go and do fieldwork with a nudist. There's a nudist group in outside of Eugene, and I was like, well, I don't know, like, is race relevant or not? Do we need to think about this? Is that I'd been to the nudist, it's not a colony, I forget what they call themselves, and it was primarily white, and I don't know, but it seemed like that was a very uncomfortable conversation. I felt like I can talk to my white students about who want to do research with African American or Native American or African or Latino, like, we need to think about this, but it becomes very uncomfortable. I think for white, I think that people of color are talking about this a lot, but I think the conversation we're not having that conversation as much in terms of all the different ways that identity comes into play. Not enough attention to intersectionality across fieldwork, not just feminists. I think I've said that at least 22 times now. I think it's important. Sex in the field. I don't think we're talking enough about that, both as pleasure, as desire. A lot of people use sex as a strategy, and by sex, I don't just mean jumping in the sack. I mean, just kind of sexual dynamics, attraction, flirting. That gets used a lot as a fieldwork method, and we don't address that. It's problematic. It happens. We should talk about it. And then, of course, we have to talk more directly and explicitly about harassment and violence, which, again, are difficult topics but need to be addressed. Okay, so the most important thing I want to say, though, what I think is most important, that is that the study about gender still tends to be predominantly about women and LGBTQIA folks, and gender is rarely engaged in studies about men. Nor do most men doing fieldwork about men give the same attention to subjectivity, intersectionality, reflexivity, positionality, etc., as do women. So when men are doing research with men, well, first of all, it's not a gendered project. It's just a project with people, and we certainly don't need to think about all of these issues because we're just doing research with people, right? But it's just as important, it's just as significant, and so I think that's something I've been really, when I teach my fieldwork classes and I have males in the student, and we start talking about gender, and I can kind of see them say, okay, phew, I don't have to take notes here. And I'm like, no, you are a gendered person, right. And your positionality matters. And when you do fieldwork with white men, they're gendered people, and they have intersectional positioning, and it can be associated with privilege, it can be associated with not, depending on who they are, and that needs to be taken into consideration. So I think we need to really broaden our discussion about gender and think about it across all different genders. So I think when women do research, the idea is that when women do research, it is by default about women. And when women in our fieldwork writing, and I think this has happened a lot to Elaine, is when we say, hey, look, my fieldwork wasn't perfect. Look, there were power differentials, and I did these things wrong, and I really had to think about them, then everybody pounces on them and say, yeah, you're a bad field worker. Whereas those people who aren't reflectively presenting the problems in their own fieldwork practice and their own positionality, everybody says, oh, they're a great fieldwork, yay! So we get this kind of invisibilizing of dominance and power because we are, not, and I say we very generally, I know that, but we tend to privilege the scholarship by the people who aren't bringing out and telling everybody their own weaknesses. So we tell people to do that, but when they do that, then we tend to think, well, they're not as good at field workers, where of course everybody's having these issues. That's a topic for a long conversation. So I will stop there and hand it over to...
All right, I'm Gina Jorgensen. I earned my PhD in folklore with a minor in gender studies from Indiana University. I've taught at Indiana University, Butler University, Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis, and UC Berkeley. So I'd like to start, my topic is intersectional feminism, and I will try to narrate this in case we have the audio but not video recording. Show of hands, who here knows what intersectional feminism is? So most hands go up in a room of over 24 people. Who learned about intersectional feminism from folklore coursework? I see 0, maybe 1. Okay, 0 hands, ish, a little bit. So my point here in introducing intersectional feminism by asking who knows what it is, most hands go up, who's learned about it through folklore coursework, no hands go up, is to talk about the absorption of feminist concepts into folkloristics. I published a paper with the folklore historian distinguishing between what I call political feminism and theoretical feminism. Political feminism saying, let's pay attention to women's topics now. Let's have an activist bent to our scholarship. Let's have these methodological conversations. Let's do more with the study of women's folklore, more with the study of gender and sexuality. I'm calling that all political feminism, whereas theoretical feminism really means rethinking concepts like gender and sexuality on a fundamental level and incorporating feminist theory, which usually comes from outside folklore studies, into folklore studies. And again, this is sort of a false dichotomy. A lot of projects do both. And I also like to note that a lot of theoretical feminism is white feminism. As Christina Downs pointed out in her earlier portion of today's talk, we're still working on decolonizing feminism to a satisfactory degree, and that project may never be done. I'd like to note that I find Sarah Ahmed's work really helpful here. Her book, Living a Feminist Life, was like my lifeline a few weeks ago. So that, for me, is really helpful in thinking through some of these concepts. So, intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism, I take to mean as the attention to different layers of identity that, in overlapping, create multiple forms of oppression that simultaneously impact people and groups. This concept was invented by African-American legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. She was both researching and helping as her capacity as a lawyer, women in battered women's shelters, women who survived domestic violence, and she was finding that many of them were immigrants or refugees, as well as being women of color or from religious minorities. And because of these identity categories they occupied, they did not have the same access to help and to resources, or they were negatively impacted in additional ways beyond simply surviving trauma. And so she came up with the concept of intersectionality to help explain, hey, here's what's going on with this. We need to be talking about this because people who are disadvantaged on one front are often disadvantaged on multiple fronts. And that's something that, again, like none of this is natural or inherent to being born a human in the world. These are systems that are created and systems that are sustained through multiple social and economic systems. So Kimberly Crenshaw came up with intersectional feminism. It's since percolated throughout much of third wave feminist practice and terminology. I tend to teach it whenever I can, but as my little show of hands exercise was meant to demonstrate, those of us in folklore studies who come to feminist theory often must do so outside the folklore classroom. Many of us try to incorporate some of these ideas, whether it's the concept of positionality, which was so brilliantly articulated by Rachel Gonzalez-Martin in the critical race theory panel yesterday. Whether we're bringing in positionality, we're bringing in intersectionality. We want to differentiate between sex and gender, perhaps. So many of these core feminist concepts are ones that we encounter outside the folklore classroom that we say, hey, that's relevant, which again falls into some of the traps that Lisa Gilman has talked about. Feminism is relevant to women. That's great. Feminism is relevant to everyone. It's intersectional feminism even more so. So in asking whether folklorists do intersectional feminism, I think we're both doing and not doing it. I think that on the one hand, again, this is not part of our discipline's core terminology. I think it should be. I think we need to make that happen. I think we need to make sure that folklorists learn about feminism not just from other feminist folklorists, or not from other feminists outside of our field. We need to bring a lot more of this to the home base in terms of our core folklore education. But when I say I think that folklorists are kind of already doing intersectional feminism, I mean that our attention to folk group as one of the core structuring concepts of our discipline means that we're already asking students when we train to consider, well, what is your group identity? List multiple ones, list overlapping ones, list contradictory ones. I know that when I assign a basic fieldwork project in any folklore class, I want my students to list the multiple folk groups of the person they're interviewing or collaborating with. If you give me just one identity, no, you fail that part of the assignment. So I think that in our attention to group identity, we have done some incredibly nuanced and excellent work here, but we don't call it intersectional feminism, in part because that's not our intellectual history yet, I might add, optimistically, but also because we lack the social justice angle that intersectional feminism tends to carry with it. We say, oh, let's be descriptive. Being descriptive is nice because we want to avoid being prescriptive. I've seen a number of conversations this weekend where we're still struggling with how much can folklorists be activists in XYZ dimension? Do we risk not being taken seriously as scholars if we step out of the ivory tower and reveal ourselves to be humans walking around in flesh suits like the rest of them, with needs and with things and with desires and with agendas? So I know that we risk falling from the illusionary tower of scholarly objectivity, the life of the mind. I know that's a risk we run. But I think that by being more attentive to the lessons of intersectional feminism, we might do better work for ourselves and for the people that we work with. And we won't work in isolation quite so much from the other social sciences and humanities and social justice movements that are all starting to come together in a lot of ways. I'm sure some of you have seen a lot of the colonization of related fields by white supremacists, whether it's medieval studies. Come talk to me afterwards if you want to hear about how folklore is in danger of being co-opted by white supremacists. There's a current blog war happening about that. And I could talk about this for longer, but I think I'll just end on a note, Whither the Witch. So acknowledging that witches are multivalent figures across various cultures, I think that in many contexts, and I know more about European witches than other cultures of witches. European witches are often marginalized figures that require us to think about positionality, that require us to think about why are they marginalized, why are they living in liminal spaces, why are they on the outskirts, why are they being othered, and oftentimes it's because of their intersecting, interlocking identities. It's not just a woman, it's an old woman. It's an old woman who's kind of defying the urban-rural divide, who's kind of complicating that by living in a liminal space. It's not just an old woman, maybe it's an old childless woman. Maybe it's an old woman who's childless who has the knowledge to keep one childless. So we see, again, a lot of intersecting identity components in what makes a witch. And again, I think we're having a lot of these conversations already in our discipline. We're just not calling it what we should call it, and we don't have the thrust of attention to social justice behind it that perhaps it should. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Afsana Rezai. I'm a PhD candidate at The Ohio State, and I did my master's in folklore in Western Kentucky, and I'm currently doing my field work. I work at the intersection of folklore, feminist folklore, post-colonial studies, Middle Eastern anthropology, and today I'm just touching briefly on basically what is post-colonial feminism, how it started, what it's looking for, and what is the role of folklore here, if there is any role. So post-colonial feminism as a field started in the 80s and started out as a critique of mainstream feminism and its tendencies towards universalizing and generalizing the feminist concerns and struggles around the world, and also for its tendency to conceptualize non-Western women as a monolithic group with certain characteristics, such as being family-oriented, domestic, victims of male dominance, having their sexuality controlled by religious or patriarchal rules, and more importantly, unconscious of their own rights. So basically this idea, this conceptualization, which is, of course, the result of years of colonization and Orientalism in the Third World. This conceptualization led Western feminists to pursue a rather global liberatory paradigm based on Eurocentric models and assume a common need among the Third World women to be spoken for by their Western, more privileged counterparts, which were nonetheless sisters in struggle with everyone around the world. So post-colonial feminism basically argued that by taking women as the category of analysis and centering around the white women in the West or developed countries and looking at non-Western women as a monolithically oppressed group, mainstream feminism misrepresents and silences the voices and the vastly different struggles of women in the Third World. And I'm using those terms loosely because Third World and First World are kind of mutually constructed in relation to one another, but they don't mean really anything but just for the sake of having something to call them. I have to use those terms. So so basically the idea was that everyone, all these, collectively and monolithically oppressed women are kind of moving towards where Western women are or are aiming to be. And this kind of results in, or resulted in, still does, in looking at it in a totalizing way and approaching the concepts of rights and freedoms in a certain way. For example, I work mostly on the Middle East, so I'm more familiar with the Middle Eastern countries, and this totalizing colonial and Orientalist approach disregards the dissimilarities of women's concerns and struggles within the Middle East, and it was also expressed earlier that there is this disregard towards people's internal differences. So, for example, in terms of the hot topics like hijab in the Middle East, we have, for example, in a country like Iran, we have women who are, expressing their need to or their desire to throw off the veil and see it as a sign of oppression and a barrier to personal freedoms. While in other countries like in Egypt or in Yemen or in Libya, some women are taking on the veil as a sign of, constructing a free self. And in still other Middle Eastern countries which are, ravaged by wars, that is not even a concern, like a feminist concern of women is just to survive and not to see their families torn to pieces. So it's not really, we cannot totalize the struggle and concerns of women in the Third World. Basically, so post-colonial feminism is trying to, find a way to avoid this overgeneralization. And the idea is that if we want to avoid the misrepresentations of the, concerns and struggles of women, feminism in the Third World needs to originate from the post-colonial context itself, which is, of course, different in each country or in each area in the Third World. So being a folklorist, of course, when I engage with this literature, I think about what is the role of folklorists? What can I do? What can I bring to this conversation? And what can I learn from this conversation? And feminist folklore, at the same time in the 80s or late 80s was, dealing with the same issues about, complicating gender as the category of analysis, the move towards intersectionality, and kind of walking away from this concept that because of their gender, women can have a way for forming solidarity. And I'm not sure if it has, worked out pretty well because, as Lisa mentioned earlier, we're still, we have a tendency towards romanticizing women's things because they're feminine. So feminist folklorists, of course, have been exploring the ways to carry out their work in a way not to drown out the voice of the interlocutors or inscribe the ethnographer as a know-all authority. And they're becoming increasingly aware of their own positionality, as it was expressed earlier, and I won't repeat that part. So we see that we have similar issues, similar concerns here for both post-colonial feminists and feminist folklorists, even though they work in different contexts. And again, to underscore what was asserted earlier, folklorists have also been not very aware of their own basically role in this whole colonial project, and they have not engaged as much as needed in this whole conversation. But anyway, we see that this concern with expressing the voice and agency of the marginalized has been a primary concern in both fields, and the issue of representation, of course, who speaks for whom, to whom, with whom, and how the voice of the marginalized can be heard out of this dominant frames and master narratives, be they colonial or orientalist or patriarchal or anything else. So as a folklorist, one would think this is a great area of contribution that we can, or a great place to start dialogue, because we're actually tackling almost similar issues and questions. But unfortunately, working at an intersection of these fields, I've seen a lot of lost opportunities here, especially because post-colonial feminism is mainly concerned with literary and historical analysis, and they're heavily invested in high theorizing, often very obscure theorizing. I mean, good luck to anyone who's reading Spivak or Baba, or you just throw up your hands and just say, okay, I'm just going to go to folklore literature. Ethnography as a model is really marginal in post-colonial feminism. And one reason is apparently that there is a suspicion towards the use of, personal narratives or personal experiences as the basis of theorizing, which is a fair, suspicion, because post-colonial theory and feminism are so concerned with coming up with grand theories, and of course you cannot base that on one personal experience, and it brings up all different issues about representation that everyone's dealing with in different fields. So basically my frustration has been with this lack of dialogue between the fields, and that we can contribute something from folklore or feminist folklore studies, both in terms of our low theorizing methods, not looking at things from the above, but as been expressed by different scholars, having a bottom-up approach, or doing low theorizing instead of using grand theories, and of course using field work can be, especially in my opinion, of course, considering all the issues that are involved in the field work, and even folklorists haven't addressed all of them so far. I think still a better method to capture the voice and agency of those we deem marginalized, rather than waiting for them to write a memoir and just analyzing it within the colonial and orientalist frames. So I think there's generally a real need to open up dialogue. And last year in the same session, I remember Joe Radner mentioned that, for example, the theory of coding, as it was proposed by feminist folklorists in 1993, has been, picked up by scholars in different fields, and that's great. I really, I'm really happy to see that's happening. But still, this was Margaret Mills is sitting there, and I was reading one of her pieces from 1993 exactly a few months ago, and she also expressed that, and I totally agree that we usually tend to have this imprint conversation with scholars, feminists in other fields, and we keep referencing them, but they don't really hear us back, apparently. And it's not like folklorists have figured it all out, as you have heard from our other speakers so far. And I think folklorists can also learn a lot from post-colonial feminists in terms of, considering the relations of power, these master narratives and Orientalist and colonial frames that even sometimes our interlocutors are using in their own, expressions of themselves, and how to, it's a long conversation. I'm just thinking about the work that I've done about this, and I don't want to bore you with that. But I think we can learn a lot from each other. Maybe they can learn a little bit more from us in terms of how to really go at capturing the agency and different kinds of agency and voice of people or especially women in the third world. So so I'll end it at that, and maybe we can talk about it later about how we can kind of export, or last night Elliot Oring was also talking about similar things, and I think it's a conversation that, besides the disciplinary anxiety and why no one acknowledges us, there's real missed opportunity here if we cannot have conversation with other people in other fields. So I end at that and leave it to Solly.
Yeah. Hi, I actually have a slide, so I'm probably going to have to go down there, but I'll introduce maybe you can get in, but it's going to ask for my witchy password, so maybe I'll get it. I'm Solima Otero. I did my PhD in Folklore and Folklife a million years ago at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you. And I work on Afro-Latinx religious cultures, and it's a really good kind of, I'm supposed to be talking about embodiment, but I'm going to talk about embodiment through the archive. And I think you're right in terms of this whole issue of having conversations. I work in comparative literature and in English, and having those kind of cross-fertilizations, especially in regards to gender, sexuality, and all of that, I think that there's definitely so much we can contribute, but I guess some basic questions like whose intersectionality, what are the multiplicity of voices, where are we starting from? Thank you. I just have one slide. Thank you so much. So I want to start a little bit from some of the work that I've been doing in the archive, and thinking about the archive and embodiment and this idea of residual transcriptions. And I want to start with this quote that I found at the Ruth Landis papers at the Smithsonian Institution. And I found this in Ruth Landis's notes. She says, "Simple water puts out despacho because water belongs to God. After I said I was an Oshun, I was told I could put my Oshun beads in water or just use simple water to cleanse the way, asking Oshun and God." And this is just a little note that she had on the side about a conversation that she had with a candomblé priest named Eulalia when she was doing her fieldwork in Bahia in 1938. So I'm going to read a little bit about what I've been writing, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the implications in terms of kind of methodology and working with women alive and ancestors. Here, two voices, one of Brazilian candomblé priestess Eulalia and one of North American ethnographer Ruth Landis, discuss the spiritual cleansing power attributed to water, the deity Oshun, and God. Much of my recent work has been about the ways that water, in particular, maps routes to subjectivities and spiritualities that are slippery, fluid, yet strongly felt as currents in the experiences and the study of Afro-Latinx religious cultures. This exchange between Eulalia and Landis, which of course is mediated through Landis's own notes, was recorded in her notes, where she engaged in the study of gender, sexuality, and race among participants in the religion. And she was doing this in the 1930s, and she suffered greatly for the kinds of reflexive work that she did. Herskovits and other folks who were studying African diaspora cultures in terms of survivals we're not looking for the kinds of intersectionality that Ruth Landis's work would later inspire. So she had a real hard time after writing The Seminole City of Women. People called it travelogue, it's not real ethnography, it's not serious ethnography, stuff like that. And she really paid the price for looking at those different intersections. So I choose to begin this bit of her story with this quote because it reflects the reported voices from a transcript of an ethnographic moment that later becomes a fragment in an archive. It also illustrates the unfinished stories, suggested unofficial connections that Landis does not include in her ethnography, The City of Women. In this matter-of-fact recollection, Landis embraces her connection to the river goddess Oshun and her own participation in the religion through obvious material culture markers like her Oshun Ileke beaded necklace. It reads in many ways, but for me, it sounds like the kind of advice that creates residual vernacular transcripts of ritual moments that become part of what I call a living archive that can't be read on paper, but you have to look at the clues through material culture, symbols, and a remarkably consistent imaginative spiritual memory. Now, this imaginative spiritual memory and this material culture is not only women doing this kind of work, but women are doing this kind of work in really significant ways in the communities which I belong to and which I study. I think the intersubjectivity between Eulalia, Landis, and Oshun suggests a reflection from the archive that conjures all three of them in a unique way out of what might be considered as a past. It makes us rethink temporality. And looking at the kind of rituals that maybe she did and she did not do. Should she wash her necklaces? Did she not? But these and other unfinished stories and their potential for thinking through the dilemma of reading transcriptions in the archives of ritual work are more and more of how I'm extending my understanding of embodiment as shared and contextual. Because for those of you who don't know my work, I've actually been working a lot with seances, spiritual seances, and embodiment in moments in ritual where there is a cohabitation of the body. And I'm really trying to use that careful attention to how that also is kind of implicated in the work that we do in the archives, because archival work can be just as violent and colonizing as doing field work, and I think we need to have those ethical considerations, but also we have those opportunities, right? So I want to consider in my Her Story Folklore the traveling transcripts generated by spirits and their mediums alongside the archival transcriptions found in Ruth Landis's notations of her spiritual growth and realizations in Brazil. By evaluating this archive that's co-produced by multiple interlocutors, which are also maybe being repossessed by the person who is doing this archival work, I'm suggesting a recalibration of folklore methodologies that explore experiences of time, spirituality, and materiality. Saying, we're talking a lot about kind of the history of feminism and folklore and what gets ignored and what doesn't get taught. In terms of embodiment and what constitute an archive, I think there's a lot of things that we don't pay attention to, like marginalia in the archive, scraps of paper, poems I found, as well as drawings. All the notations that make up a life that aren't necessarily centered and can be made into like traditional historiography and ethnography. I've really been paying a lot of attention to that because I think that has to play hand in hand with some of the theoretical considerations that we're thinking about. Because if we're looking for particular kinds of culture to represent feminisms of color or other kinds of feminisms, what we're looking for, what we're trying to find, in doing so, we might be missing a whole another set of stories, right? And I think that's kind of what my work is kind of trying to get at. What are the residual transcripts that I'm missing because I'm looking in these ways that we've been taught to look in our different methodologies for certain kinds of stories that represent certain kinds of feminisms or certain kinds of folklore. So I wanted to think about embodied practice as also something that people do in the archive, and then we're cohabiting. It's very much like it's a different kind of co-presence than when a ritual, when somebody's having a spirit be co-present with you, but it's also a kind of sensorial embodied moment, and I think that that's really important for us to consider because of the ethical questions that I've already talked about. But I've worked a lot with Lydia Cabrera's archives as well. I think you all know that from last year. And both Landis and Cabrera were tricksters in their archive, and the pieces they left behind. And in terms of Landis's work, her field notes, she had them coded that they were just one-sided, and then a notebook would be one-sided notation, then you turn them around and be the other side. It took me 3 days to figure that out, because I was also dealing with Portuguese. So I think that it's really fascinating that what makes sense to one life and one mind, and it can, to these women who are really trailblazers and looking at these different traditions, that the clues that they leave behind aren't very straightforward either. So that idea of being allowed to go on that journey and to be tricked is, I think, a very important kind of feminist methodology. So really, I'm really interested in vernacular documentation. Lately, I've been working with transcripts that people make on site at rituals, and how these scraps of paper get passed around and get reused and reincorporated into the community, and how maybe that doesn't even have to look like scraps of paper, like I mentioned. It could be the construction of altars, divination, beading, all different kinds of work that have meaning within the community itself, and has meaning that reflects certain kinds of experiences of gender, sexuality, social positioning. All of that is involved with that, and just kind of recalibrating where I'm looking for embodiment, and recalibrating where I'm looking for kind of those stories that can give us the texture. I mean, it's great to talk about post-colonial feminisms and being reflexive and positioning yourself, and that's very important. But then there's also textures and other kinds of stories that the people in the community themselves may want to tell, and they may frame that differently. And we may not be able to see it because it doesn't look like what we're expecting. So that's all I've got for you today, and I'm really excited to be on this panel. This is really, really exciting.
Okay, so I'm the last to speak, but I am, it was my idea to do the witchy thing, so I'm really going to run with it. I hope you guys will indulge me. My name is Brittany Warman. I am a PhD candidate in English and Folklore at Ohio State. So, at the heart of all feminist inquiry, and about everything we've been talking about here, is the question of activism. The choice of bringing up this stuff, of pointing it out, of questioning it, is always a move meant to motivate action and change. So the world we live in today has inspired numerous new feminist activists, people of all genders, who would have even 2 years ago never joined a protest, are now organizing them, determined to speak back to those who would silence them. For many of these people, the figure of the witch provides a perfect inspiration. In the wee hours of June 20th, 2017, for example, thousands of witches of all kinds, all over the world, cast a, quote, binding spell on President Trump in an attempt to restrict his agenda and ensure he, quote, does no harm. This was an act that was, according to Vox, equal parts quasi-religious ritual and activist performance. While some of those who took part in the event believed wholeheartedly in the potential magical results of the ritual, many others saw it as chiefly having a psychological impact that gave them further motivation to continue to act. Regardless of any truly supernatural elements, the ritual provided a space to simply counter a sense of powerlessness. These kinds of rituals continued to be performed, and indeed a fascinating new anthology of personal essays called Becoming Dangerous will seek to explore the intersection of feminism, witchcraft, and resistance, specifically via ritual. Women are also using the figure of the witch to fight back in smaller ways. For example, Britton Boyd, who runs the blog Archaic Honey, wrote a post called A Witch's Resistance and Action List that has gone viral. This list focuses on the small but still witchy ways one might resist the current state of the world and make steps toward change. So none of these ideas are, of course, new. Kristen Soley traces the act of using the witch as a figure of resistance and activism back to Matilda Joslyn Gage, an early promoter of women's suffrage, whose 1893 book, Women, Church, and State, was among the first to reassess the legacy of the witch. To Gage, witches were simply women with superior knowledge who were attacked due to the patriarchal societies in which they lived. During the 1960s, there was, of course, the witch groups. These groups were designed to explicitly introduce the idea of witches into contemporary political action. The Witch Manifesto states that witch is an all-woman everything. It's theater, revolution, magic, terror, joy, garlic flowers, spells. It's an awareness that witches were the original guerrillas and resistance fighters against oppression, particularly the oppression of women down through the ages. Though these groups were fairly short-lived, they continued to act as key inspirations to new groups using the historical and mythological weight of the witch to challenge heteropatriarchy and white supremacy today. The strikingly strong presence of the folkloric figure of the witch in today's feminist activism seems to indicate that folklorists have a powerful role to play as these narratives continue to take shape. To quote scholar Pam Grossman, the figure of the witch has become so popular because there's something inherently empowering about finding personal resonance with a story. And as folklorists, we understand the power of stories better than anyone. Where then can folklore scholarship make a difference? How can one be a feminist folklorist on the front lines of change? We need only look to the program for this year's meeting to see the numerous ways in which folklorists are using their particular expertise to advance women's rights and tell women's stories. Consider, to name just a few examples, the multiple papers this year devoted to the 2017 Women's March, the Minnesota Native American Women's Storytelling Event, and the panel on resistance, feminism, and sisterhood through voluntary associations like the Girl Scouts and roller derby teams. We even had a panel devoted to foodways as feminist resistance. And these are, of course, only the projects devoted to women. There are many, many more that engage with the equally feminist issues of race, sexuality, and disability. Our field is so rich with opportunities to explore and shine light on the continuing project of equality. Within our organization itself, the new harassment policy is only one example of the important steps forward we're making as a group meant to ensure that AFS events continue to be the supportive and inclusive environments they are meant to be. Folklorists are making important moves outside of our organizations and academic work as well, though. To single out one of our speakers here, Gina Jorgensen's popular blog, The Foxy Folklorist on Patheos, aids in the incredibly crucial work of moving feminist folkloristics into the public sphere. Her topics range such topics as privilege, the plight of the independent scholar, emotional and physical pain, shame and sex, but almost always return to the lens of folklore and feminism. The fact that her blog has traction and that her posts are regularly shared across the internet is a major win for the work we're trying to do and the messages we're trying to spread. There are, of course, many public folklore projects that function as activists as well. For example, the recent nationally traveling exhibition, Empowering Women, Artisan Cooperatives That Transform Communities, curated by Suzanne Seraph, aimed to, quote, examine the revolutionary international movement of women artisans who are sustaining their arts and enriching their lives by collectively producing, managing, and marketing traditional crafts. This exhibition was not only a success on its own, it also inspired the American Alliance of Museums-funded project Museums/Market Alliance, which has the goal of harnessing the social entrepreneurial power of the marketplace with the educational authority of the museum to more effectively address the needs of our changing audiences and artists alike. So our work makes us activists always and already. So what else can we do? Where can we go next? As far as I'm concerned, we should continue to follow the path of the witch, as our predecessors have been trying to do for many years. As Grossman puts it, the witch is the ultimate creator. She conjures, she transforms, she manifests, and she does so without apology. So we keep speaking out, we keep doing our work, we keep starting conversations, we continue to think in the innovative and interdisciplinary ways that folklorists can about how we can help further. As so many have already shown at this meeting, the tools of our discipline are powerful. We keep making our voices heard in as many ways as we can, through our academic work, through our public work, and through our personal work. So that's what I have to say about that. Okay. Thanks.
You know, I am really impressed because in thinking about the panel last year, I think that so much of what we initially did in folklore and feminism in the 70s and 80s, and coming into the 90s, but early 90s, was very much about, well, it was fieldwork based. Mm-hmm. So it was really about going into the field and working with women and really trying to assess, you know, what their lives were like and, you know, how tradition and culture, you know, played a role. And then moving into that territory that I think folklore did so well in that era, which was to begin a process of seeing what some of the, you know, more subversive strategies of, you know, that women used within the context of living in fairly sort of patriarchally dominated situations. That's where we all kind of went out there and looked at that. And then of course the second feature was a reclamation feature too, I think, of drawing on older sources, but not so much. I mean, what is so interesting about Sully and Gina, in terms of looking at people like Landis and others like that. I think that the work that we did earlier was much more a reclamation of images. So then Brittany comes back with this whole thing about the witch that, of course, I'll be carrying forward on in about 2 hours. But, it's a really, again, I think it's really interesting, too, that there was real concern back in the 70s and 80s about stories and, proverbs and things of that nature, a lot in the, kind of in the small, the folktale, but really trying to look at figures, look at figures of power, that whole kind of reclamation of figures of power, and it was really important work, but I'm just very impressed with the way that, you all have a position of interrogation on the stuff that we really did not. And I think that's really distinguishing in a way that to a certain extent, the 1986 Folklore and Feminism Conference was the first and then, kind of became the only, well, it wasn't the first, I take that back, there was one in Penn, a smaller one in Penn. But interrogation, kind of happened in that moment, and it went through the line into various women's work in the discipline, but then also kind of petered out. And part of the reason was that, scholars coming in the late 80s and 90s, young women, they weren't being taught, that it wasn't, the ball was not being pushed forward in the programs at IU or, yeah.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, but as somebody who went through IU at that time, Beverly Stolce had a...
Oh, yeah, yes.
I mean, now many of us studied with Beverly, and many of us did real feminist work.
No, I'm glad,
so I think it's important
I was
that
taught by Beverly too, she's awesome, so.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this with a panel yesterday, but I think, or the question about intersectionality is that I don't think she used the word intersectionality, but she was introducing us to third world feminism. Right. We were doing very politically engaged work, and there's a whole crew of us that come out from her. So I just think it's important that we recognize our mothers.
No. That's very good. That's very good.
Can I ask you that during that time, Deborah Caption and Dorian Marks were also starting to teach that both of them taught at IU during those early 90s, and then one of the other places too. And they were also doing a lot of that. So there was some.
There was some, yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you,
No, I'm glad, I'm just trying to, sort of look broadly at sort of where we've come from and
I think another, can I?
Yes, absolutely, I was just.
I think another thing that happened is that feminism had such a big impact that a lot of women, like I have a lot of friends, colleagues that are women that are doing work that they don't call feminist. That is very much informed from feminism. I mean, it's kind of like performance studies. A lot of people do performance studies, but they can't actually articulate what performance studies is because it's kind of infiltrated and become what a lot of people do.
Right.
And I would argue that a lot of men do as well. I mean, people, I shouldn't be just binaryizing, but people of all genders. I mean, I think just kind of the thinking about subjectivity and position and power, a lot of that is informed by feminism. So even though people might not say I'm doing a feminist project, we should recognize the feminism that's happening.
Okay, I have things to say. I think it's important to distinguish between post-feminism and the normalization of feminist perspectives here, because I've encountered a lot of what's been called post-feminism, which is the idea like, wow, feminists got women the vote. Cool, we're done. We can go home. Feminism is over. We have achieved our goals. And I find that post-feminism has percolated into pop culture and probably into many facets of the academy, the sense that, like, you know, unless you're specifically looking at like reproductive justice or whatever, you don't need to live yourself as a feminist. Feminism is done. And I think it's very pervasive and very pernicious. At the same time, I think we can be striving for a normalization of feminism, but that should not mean that it goes unremarked or unnamed. I think it's important to situate what we're doing in this disciplinary history and to say that we're far from true gender equality or equality among any number of intersectional axes. So I think we do need to keep naming it. We do need to keep pushing for it.
And I would like to add, it's interesting because there is an audience out there for feminism. I teach Ngozi Adichie's Americana a lot, and a lot of my students knew her from her TED Talk, right? And so I think there is an audience out there. There is a need to redefine. The issue is how, I guess, do we as feminist folklorists do that kind of work within and outside of disciplinary bounds, you know, because those conversations may not be in a folklore classroom, or may, you know, those moments may be in another space. So I think we've got to be kind of supple and ample in terms of engaging those conversations where people are.
I will add too that I think it's really important that we do it in this moment. When I was looking at the sort of the things I was reading about the hexing Trump kind of thing and all of that, a lot of the people in there there was a repeated narrative that I wouldn't have called myself a feminist, you know, a year or two ago, but I would now. And so I think people are really receptive at this particular moment in time to hear why feminism is still important.
I just want to clarify that I absolutely think that feminism is completely important. I was just responding to the idea that if we're looking at the impact of feminism on our scholarship, like if we were trying to do an intellectual history of feminist scholarship and folklore, that it would be interesting to kind of broaden our scope to stuff that says this is feminist, to stuff that is informed by feminism that might not be labeled as such. But I'm not part of the post-feminist thing, and I teach very actively. So I'll make sure it's more exciting. Nikki Etter.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to correct Gina's whole version, because that was really interesting. No, I should have raised my hand about whether intersectionality or intersectional feminism folklore. Talia, like, is much more practice. Some of them being like, okay, we learned it, but we learned it from folklore, then kind of like, oh, yeah, it was. Kind of, you know, so if I get just simply that it's Lisa. Yeah, thank you.
And if I can respond briefly to that, first off, good job. Good job, Lisa.
And Carol Silverman back there.
Yeah.
Very specifically.
Yeah, and second, I didn't get all the way through this part of prepping for this talk, but I just started typing in, I'll log on to Project Muse and get on JAF and type in intersectional feminism, and there's like 1 or 2 hits. And so I was going to do more things with different word combinations, you know, having an and in front of between them, or intersectionality versus intersectional. I was going to do a lot more searching, but my preliminary sense is that there's not a lot of it in our publications, in our core publications. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Olga and I were co-editing the Chicana book, Chicana Traditions.
One of the best books.
One of the questions, so is this feminist?
Mm-hmm.
And how are we defining feminist approaches? Because a lot of the work, the author did not identify as a feminist analysis, but it was. When you're looking at a Bandera Harbor in Mexico, you're already a feminist by highlighting that word. So sometimes it's in the interpretation. That's what defines what it is. And the other point is that I agree with you, so that the spaces for these
Absolutely. And also different terms, because people might call themselves mujerista, you're not feminist, right? And they have different kind of ways in which, in Cuba, people don't define themselves as feminists, but there are certainly women who take, stands, and that's absolutely right. I was thinking even in your own, in your living room with your tia, she might be telling you a story and doesn't define herself as a feminist, but has stood up to all sorts of, things like immigration and exile. So absolutely, I think that's a really good point.
I want to respond to something. Do you want to carry on with that or go in a different direction? So one of the things that I see, and I think it's speaking to a lot of what Brittany talked about in terms of feminist activism, that really does intersect with one of the primary things we do as folklorists is we are always interested in the esoteric perspective. We want the insider perspective, and that means that we have concepts that have been floating around a discipline for centuries, like the idea of communal censorship and communal recreation, that if enough people in the community say that's not Cinderella, that's not that story, then people go with it, right? We talk about the ideal forms and types that tend to cohere and become transmitted as and recognized as tradition. And this is a problem because if we're studying feminism and we're identifying as feminists and then we encounter pro-life feminists who want to march with us, it's like, no, I'm sorry, by definition, if you are advocating for a stance that actively harms women, you are not a feminist. So at what point do we throw down prescriptively and normatively? And I mean, that's a pretty low bar to set, like, don't harm women, you can call yourself a feminist. But at what point do we have to come down on the side of being prescriptive that, no, this is an activist stance that needs to have a couple things in play in order to deserve the name?
She was in the middle said, she closed out that conference by saying, and it was so powerful, and I think everybody was here, she said, we just got to keep putting the hammer to the walls. We just got to keep that out and that. You know, even talking to her afterwards, like, and then, like there was like a post reception, like everybody's like crying, like hugging her, because it was just one of those things there. Anyway, yeah, that's all I had to add.
Sort of other things, I wondered, I really appreciate those different perspectives that y'all bring me, like classroom skills and theory. I wondered if you could talk much about some of the more kind of day-to-day aspects of feminist work and scholarship, like things like sexual harassment, pay equity, expectations of service and emotional labor, curriculum policies, like things that kind of otherwise might influence our perspectives and abilities and restrictions on things.
I think we certainly need to have conversations about those. Some people know, not many people, because it's fairly. I work at something at IU called the Institute for Advanced Study, which is a institute. Lots of universities have institutes for advanced study, and they're usually things that are there to promote scholarly excellence of the university. IU's is unusual in that part of it, a very large part of its mission is helping associate professors get promotion to full professor. And from working there, I've noticed a lot of interesting things and heard some really interesting stories, particularly from female faculty members. We had one faculty member that was working with us in what we call a promotion cohort, which is a group of people that meet on a regular basis to help put together their promotion cases, and it kind of dropped off and stopped communicating with us, and then finally contacted us and said, here's what's been going on. My chair all of a sudden told me I needed to go up a year earlier than I was planning to, and it's just sort of known in my department that women don't make full professor. They always get sabotaged somehow or another internally within the department. And so when they told me I had to go up a year early, I just assumed this was how I was going to be sabotaged in my promotion case. And the fact that that's just for still, in this day and age, that there are women working in a university setting, which is perceived as being such a wonderful, liberal place to be, that are just told that it's a given that they're not going to make it to full professor because that's not something that happens for women in their departments. Things that, like the fact that women are constantly penalized on promotion cases for co-authoring when men are not, because it's always assumed that if a man and woman write something together, then the man was the primary investigator, whether he was actually or not. Things like family leave, that women are consistently penalized for having children in their careers and men are not. The fact that there are study after study coming out showing that women, and particularly women of color, take on more of the service burden in their departments, which can inhibit their ability to do research, which can then inhibit their ability to progress along the promotion track. We have not had conversations about these, but I think that these are conversations we need to have as a field if we want there to be excellence in scholarship by women and excellence in female scholarship or feminist scholarship. We need to also be helping women get into positions where they can be doing that scholarship. If they can't do that because they can't pay their bills, they can't hold on to a job, then, you know. I think I brought up more points and I don't have any answers, but at least.
I'll note that we've mentioned collaboration a couple of times as something that's both often a strength because it's something that really exemplifies feminist values in many ways, and I think it's something that a lot of us do and we do very well, but then when it becomes the default expectation that women are just better at that kind of thing, or, you know, women are better at communicating, well, no, we've had to become better at it because the bulk of emotional labor is dumped on us. Thank you very much. So I think that talking about collaboration is, you know, it's multifaceted, and we have to be really aware of what we're getting into when we choose to collaborate. And I've had a number of excellent collaborations, including with Brittany at this table. So, but I do want to point out that I'm collaborating on a piece in an adjacent field in the digital humanities that's currently under review. And what we're doing is we're looking at the conference submission data from the worldwide digital humanities conferences and looking at the genders and oftentimes ethnicities and national origins of the people submitting and the people being accepted and the people publishing. And a lot of what we're finding is that while women are presenting a lot of the conference papers and they're collaborating a lot, they're not often getting first author. They're not often getting the more prestigious things. And so that's something that here at AFS, we could actually study that. I'm sure we have that information. So that is one sort of like day-to-day academic life thing that we could be more proactive about investigating, and we could use fancy digital humanities tools to do so.
You brought up so many different issues, and I think it's more than I can handle, but I thought I would just, it's Saturday, so I'll make everybody laugh. I love the essay by, I think it's in Joe Radner's coding book about, it's like burning dinners, and so it's in it, for those of you who haven't read it, the premise is women doing domestic labor, maybe like in houses where the woman is doing all of the, taking care of the house, and this kind of acts of resistance where she maybe burns her, I think one of the examples is she consistently burns dinner, burns the clothing and ironing, so eventually the husband's like, okay, fine, don't cook dinner ever again, I don't want you to cook dinner, but it's actually a subversive act to get out of having to do everything. And one of the ways one of the things that I've noticed is the exact opposite, is the claiming of incompetency as a way to maintain power and dominance. And I don't think we've talked at all about that, so I'd like to give you an example, and we all have seen this, is in department or different work environments where somehow our male colleagues, and it's not just men who do this, they claim to not be very good at certain things, like advising students, or certain leadership things, or certain committee work. And so because they're not doing it very well, then others of us who are, of course, very competent, we step in and we do it, and we end up picking up a lot of the slack and doing a whole lot of work. And then it turns out that because they're not doing that work, then they're home publishing and doing the thing that maybe is going to get a lot more recognition and maintain them in a powerful position. And so I just thought I would share my analysis using that article.
Really interesting an example of strategic incompetence, how strategic incompetence can be strategically used in the workplace. And I wonder what thoughts people have about the ways in which the precarious employment situation that so many people find themselves in, how that complicates the ability for women to take advantage of strategic incompetence.
Well, I can talk from my experience. I mean, I'm in an English department right now, and I'm just starting to direct a complet department, and frankly, strategic incompetence is not, strategy that is at my disposal. Actually, setting those boundaries and saying no. I mean, it's an institutional expectation that women are going to do that work, at least from where I work, right? And it's part of the infrastructure of how different programs operate. And this is not only in the level of faculty, but it's also in the level of the kinds of work that some female graduate students are asked to model, right? And kinds of tasks they're asked to do in preparation for either conferences or other kinds of professionalization that they need. So I certainly do see that it's not, at least for me as a Latina in my department, I mean, I say no, but it's not received in the same way as somebody else saying no. So, yeah.
I think this silence after my question is compelling.
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
It's a
Yeah.
strategy that we've seen, I think most of us have seen our peers take advantage of that.
Right.
Often does not seem available to us.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, and I wonder if this is something that those of us in the room who are in positions that are more secure, that are more privileged or have more power available to them, can use that position the women who are either report to them or are under them in some kind of way, either are not overburdened by
Right.
these kinds of tasks, or are given the room to say no and be evaluated on a local basis as their colleagues.
So what I've actually seen, this happened at a faculty meeting about 2 months ago, is actually this you were talking about collaboration. There was kind of a collective, and I don't know how formal this was, it just kind of happened. It was just kind of this collective kind of outrage. I don't want to talk too much about particulars, but somebody was being put up for movement forward, and they had done absolutely no service, and it was just basically understood, he didn't need to do as much service because women are so good at doing service. I mean, it wasn't mentioned that way, but there was this kind of collective moment where there was really kind of this beginning of a conversation and a beginning of an just kind of like acknowledgement that this is part of this culture and it has to change. Now, in terms of the power structure is not evenly already, it's not worked out in such a way. So you might have somebody who's doing something at a certain level, but there's still another power structure up there that's going to serve as a buffer to try to do that kind of collective work. But I think that, some of it has to do with collaboration and vernacular communication among those of us who are kind of dealing with that structural issue. I mean, every institution is a little different, but I think that we're all we're dealing with that. And also that precariousness, like you're saying, of the employment makes it a really important ethical issue to deal with. So anybody who is kind of
Employed yet. I can't
no,
talk about it.
but maybe what have you kind of experienced as a student, right? Getting prepared for professionalization. I mean, have you had an advisor say, hey, these are the situations that you might have to confront because you're a woman doing this work and.
Well, Brittany, do you have anything to offer? Because go ahead.
Well, I would just say that I think there's a degree to which this starts at a very early stage.
Yeah.
I've seen it happen in my graduate department that the female grad students have typically, not universally, there have been some great male grad students that I've worked with who've done great service for our department. But there have been a lot of cases where the female grad students have taken on the burden of planning events, running student organizations, helping department activities. I have, on more than one occasion, seen male faculty members ask female graduate students to bring baked goods to things where there was no way that was an appropriate thing to ask. And that isn't happening in the same way to male colleagues, which again allows them to spend more time on their research, to spend more time in their scholarship, and then they tend to be rewarded more with things like fellowships and assistantships because they're doing more on their scholarship. And, so that's how things end up the way they are down the road.
So just speaking as contingent faculty, because I've been adjuncting for 5 years, I really like what Soli said about boundaries. And I think that this, again, points to the importance of feminist theory as a framework for understanding socialization processes and systems of power that infiltrate every aspect of our lives, because I think that we're not really taught, and speaking, as a cisgender Western middle-class woman, not really taught how to set healthy boundaries. And moreover, what happens in the context of patriarchy, again, Western patriarchy, is that people who are used to getting what they want, when they encounter a firmly, politely set boundary, they're offended. They are harmed by me setting a neutral boundary that says this is the extent of what I will or will not do with my time and my body. No, thank you. It's interpreted as offensive, as an assault on their whatever. So I think that we are challenged, and again, those of us in contingent positions are especially vulnerable. And I could say more, but I've been talking a lot, and I think there was a question.
All students involved in coursework and what that
I think that speaks too to the extent to which a lot of our colleagues can look at, okay, this panel is her story, this is the women's panel.
Well, and, oh, yeah.
I just wanted to ask now, and maybe I'm not totally correct what we're reading is that raise your hand if you're a grad student or graduated within the last 10 years and you don't have permanent employment yet.
Okay, yep.
You've had permanent employment for more than 10 years.
Permanent,
So I think it's very telling that not very many senior women have shown up here today too, and I'm sorry about that.
Well, I will also raise the point because it occurred to me earlier as I was sitting up here. And I do want to thank all of you guys for coming. I really want to thank communities for organizing this. But last year, because the discussion by the senior women went long, there was a lot of criticism. I wanted to hear the younger women talk. I wanted to hear the younger women talk. And a lot of the people that I heard that complaint from are not here. So if you want to hear the younger women talk, you have to come here. Probably the younger women are talking.
And something, I wonder maybe if some of the reason for the skew, other than just the scheduling of so many concurrent sessions, you know, one of the key insights from feminist theory that I think is still relevant today is the personal is political. And this brings me back to the question about just sort of the daily ways in which we have to use feminist practices to navigate all this patriarchal bullshit. And so I wonder if maybe some of our younger colleagues are just like a little more aware in certain ways just because of things like body grooming practices. Like, how do you have to look in order to teach? I wonder if some of us who are younger are maybe, like, we're grappling with that in a different way that brings it more to the forefront, that makes us want to come and, like, talk about these things together. Because that, again, like, thinking about the daily ways in which we have to navigate life as people who, not all are women or would identify as a woman, but all of us here are interested in feminism. Again, like, you know, how do you have to look in order to teach? How do your teaching avows reflect whether you're more of a feminine-looking person or not, things of that nature. I've noticed a lot of really astute commentary from my fellow feminist folklorists in my generation. So I don't know, maybe it's just more of a thing that we're interested in.
Another everyday practice thing that goes back to Mary's comment about who's in the room and your really important counting of the syllabi, which I'm so glad you're doing that because I've been thinking about doing that for years. And so thanks for taking on that labor. But I think it's, we are all, we as in, I don't know who we are, but we're all complicit in the canonization of certain men. I mean, both in terms of all what, you know, and not every single person, some people are doing different things, but I mean, how many of us know each other's work, for those of us who have our work out there? How many of us really know what the other person is doing, the other people are doing in who are not men? And how many of us actively cite those people? When you're reading essays and you think about who, you know, the person mentions, you know, material culture, okay, Henry Class, you know, how much are we thinking, wait, no, stop. It's not these two people, it's these, you know, right in the margin, you have to go read this person and this person, and making sure that some of those people are women or genderqueer people. And so I think we have to recognize our own complicity, and we have to be activists. And we talk about activism, I think it's really important to go out on the streets, but we need to be activists on an everyday level. And I keep thinking about it, because we've been talking a lot about mentorship, and we need to mentor women students, and I'm on the mentorship committee, and I'm like, well, you know, we kind of do this thing where, like, there's a man and he's interested in something and we pair him with a man, there's a woman of color, we pair her with a woman of color, there's a woman we pair, and that's very important, because I think it's very important for women of color to have a community and mentors that are people of color. I think that's really, really important. But it's also really important for white men to be mentored by women of color, and it's really important for men to be mentoring, white men to be mentoring women. And I think we need to be really deliberate and thoughtful and activist in these things that we're all really busy and we can have patterns of ways of doing it.
Luckily, we know how to study patterns.
We know how to study it, but I feel like we we're very good at studying patterns in our fieldwork, but I don't know, I think we know so much about community building, whatever, and I don't think we put that same attention into thinking about our society or our workplaces or our relationships. And
So who's like the official?
No, I was like,
other questions? Should we say, oh wait, are there any other questions or comments? Anybody have any? Thank you.
thank you.